Good morning, Bethel Baptist Church. Good to see you this morning. Ron Boland asked me this morning what sweatshirt I was wearing, and so Ron, here you go. Here's what I'm going with today. I know Jared Long would love to see me in a suit and tie this morning, but this is what you get. Um, Thankful for technology again. If you know me at all, you know this is not um, my preference. Obviously, I've been watching the weather um, all week long. I do feel, as the under shepherd that God's appointed to oversee the flock at Bethel, but part of that pastoral care is making decisions with wisdom and guidance from the Lord, and also our deacons and Pastor CJ, and trusting the Lord to give us wisdom in those. And so this was not a easy decision. Um, Last night I was going to check on Sandy, and um, please pray for her. She has really went downhill this week, especially over the last 48 hours. Continue to pray for her and Kenny and Christy and just that whole family, that you would um, just lift them up. Trust the Lord to give them exactly what they need in this time. But as I was headed there yesterday, I was thinking about already more than likely the timing of this was going to make for a difficult decision. And I woke up about 3 this morning and checked, and obviously there was nothing that would make it easier. And then this morning I got up, and still, you just don't know. I mean, the main roads were clear, and so I was waiting on feedback from our pastors and deacons, and I was checking with other people and some other pastors, and as more and more reports come in, nobody was with the idea that the roads were perfectly safe. And so at that point, you have to begin to think about what is the best way to care for the flock. And I trust that we made the right decision, especially given the fact that we can gather around the Word via YouTube and radio. And I want to welcome all those on WHBN. I know that you don't get to see my long sleeve shirt this morning that Ron Boland was looking forward to seeing, but um, I'm thankful that we can still gather around the Word together and pray together, not in the way that we would hope to, but a way that we've been blessed to be able to do during times like this. So then once we make a decision, I've had a short amount of time to really process and think through this. I definitely don't want to start a new series in Obadiah, which I know that many of you have been on the edge of your seat about and just can't wait. You were going to walk to church if you had to be a part of the beginning of that sermon series. And so because of that overwhelming excitement, and many of you just cannot wait for Obadiah, we're going to call an audible this morning, and I trust this is from the Lord's direction. A passage that kept on coming to mind this week as I studied, I believe will help prepare our hearts even more for this study in Obadiah. And so we're going to pause that, as we have done. We've done a lot of pausing here in January. So I'm going to pause that for next week, Lord willing. Lord willing is the key phrase here this January of 2025. We have been taught several times already, Lord willing, we will gather. Lord willing, we will do this or do that. And because of that, this morning, we're going to be, I would venture to say, this is probably Liz's favorite book, so she'll be excited. We're going to be in James 4. So if you got your Bible or your tablet or your phone or your laptop, please turn SportsCenter off this morning. Gather with your family, and let's enjoy the Word. And we'll be in James chapter 4. James chapter 4. We're going to be looking at verse 13 through 17. We will see what seems to be a desire here in this passage to make a profit that has become such a priority that it has resulted in arrogant certainty of the future, which would lead to arrogant living without any regard really to God's plans and His sovereign control. It would, I just mentioned about the fact of us thinking about what's next in our church gatherings, and I'll send something out later about Bible and breakfast, and I'll intentionally word it this way. Lord willing, we will have Bible and breakfast with the bros on February the 3rd. Lord willing. Again, we have been reminded that everything in this life, whether we want to acknowledge it or not, is not really under our control. There are decisions that we make on a daily basis, and there is planning that we do, but ultimately, what is next is not in our ultimate control. And we're going to see that this morning. So if you'll look with me, if you would, grab your Bibles. Hopefully you've had plenty of time to do so. James chapter 4, beginning in verse 13. So James chapter 4, beginning in verse 13. Let's look and see what it says here. Come now, you who say, today or tomorrow we will go into such and such a town and spend a year there and trade and make a profit. Yet you do not know what tomorrow will bring. What is your life? For you're a mist that appears for a little time and then vanishes. Instead, you ought to say, if the Lord wills, we will live and do this or that. As it is, you boast in your arrogance. All such boasting is evil. So whoever knows the right thing to do and fails to do it, for him it is sin. That's important. Let me read that to you again. So whoever knows the right thing to do and fails to do it, for him it is sin. And so we know that there are sins of commission. There are things that we do that are sinful. And then there are things that we don't do that are sinful. And so when we know the right thing to do and do not do it, that is sin. So with that idea in mind, let's pray, and we'll begin to unpack this passage this morning. Father, thank you again that we are able here to be live under the Word via WHVN and as well as YouTube this morning. Thank you for that. And I just pray that you would bless us through your Word for your glory and your honor. Speak to us this morning. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen. And so let's begin to unpack this. One big thought that I think we see here, and we'll unpack it the best way we can. I believe here in James 4:13 through 17, we see this reality that we need to avoid this godless presumption of thinking that our lives, our future, any earthly endeavor that we could imagine rest in our own hands. So avoid this godless presumption of thinking that our lives, our future, or any kind of earthly endeavor is ultimately in our hands, but instead, I believe this passage is pointing us to humbly submit ourselves to the will of God. If He's really the Lord of our lives, we will see things as coming from His hands, and we will want to seek counsel in all things. And so, even this morning, I was super stressed on what to do. Liz recognized that, and I'm thankful for her so much. This is part of the side that you don't often get to see. But she grabbed me this morning, and she embraced me and prayed over me. Prayed that the Lord would give me wisdom. And in that moment, that's what I needed. And I needed to be reminded, even through my wife's prayer, to seek counsel from the Lord. Yes, the feedback from some of you that were out on the roads, feedback from the deacons and Brother CJ, obviously that's important, but most important is where the Lord leads, right? In our earthly endeavors. And so we're humbly here in this passage submitting ourselves to the will of God, acknowledging the fact that we rely upon God for any kind of plan or decision or future decision. We're confessing our dependence upon God, and that's what we're seeing in this passage. So beginning in verse 13, we could say it this way: this presumptuous living is foolishly disregarding the will of God. Verse 13, come now, or this call to pay close attention, pay close attention. Come now, you who say today or tomorrow, we will go, not that we might go, but we will go into such and such a town and spend a year there and trade and make a profit. And so we see this parable of this businessman, this traveling Jewish merchant. So the customs of this time was to trade from city to city, carrying goods on the back of camels. And so the Jews would trade in Tyre, Sidon, Caesarea, Crete, Ephesus, Philippi, Thessalonica, Corinth, Rome. And so this traveling merchant life that James is ultimately alluding to here is giving us a little bit of insight. I love what Spurgeon says here. He says, notice that these people, while they thought everything was at their disposal, used everything for worldly objects. What did they say? Did they determine with each other, we will today or tomorrow do such and such a thing for the glory of God and for the extension of his kingdom? Oh no, there was not a word about God in it from beginning to end. And so the merchant here in this parable that James shares chooses their own time, today or tomorrow. You see that they choose their own location, such and such a town. They even choose their own duration, spend a year, their own endeavor. They choose they're going to trade, their own objectives, to trade and make a profit. See, their plan, the merchant's plan, was to carry on as if God was unimportant and didn't even exist. The merchant should have made their plans in prayer while anticipating that God may change those plans. Obviously, our plans this week was to gather for worship, begin the series of Obadiah. We were all, yes, super excited about that. But God, in times of our life, changes our plans, right? So a quick reality check. Wise planning is not sinful. It's not. Even seeking to make a profit is not sinful in itself. But it's prideful. It's even foolish to not seek the Lord in those plans. Wise planning is ultimately leaving room for God's plan to overthrow our plans rather than never making plans. Let me illustrate it this way. I wonder if we asked the Lord about playing the lottery or selling an item to someone that we know isn't what it seems to be, or choosing a second or odd job knowing we would neglect our family and worship, if that would change our plans. See, oftentimes we ask God not what we should do, but God, would you please bless what we do? Consider that again. We often ask God not what we should do, but bless what we do. Sometimes we find ourselves asking God not where we should go, but bless us where we'll go. We're more apt to say, God, give us traveling mercies than we are, God, do I need to make this particular trip? Verse 14, yet you do not know what tomorrow will bring. You do not know what tomorrow will bring. That reminds us of Proverbs 27, verse 1. Do not boast about tomorrow, for you do not know what a day may bring. What is your life? For you are a mist. You are steam rising from a pot that appears from a little time and then vanishes. James rebukes the person who habitually lives life that makes future plans without any regard to the providence of God. So it's foolish to live as if God doesn't exist or is indifferent to human behavior. You can't help but think about Kenneth Copeland blowing COVID-19 away. We know he's a false teacher, but how foolish for him to think that his attitude towards that blowing COVID-19 away was foolishly acting as if God didn't exist and was indifferent. We do not control tomorrow. We can't blow away anything. We can't blow away this crazy weather. We are frail and life is really short. Sam Alberry said, as Christians, we know where we'll be in 1,000,000 years. That is in God's hands, and He's told us about it. But we don't know what will happen tomorrow. True? That is in God's hands. But He hasn't told us about it. See, we tend to plan our lives as if we're really in control, right? We often make plans without involving God. We assume if we planned it, it will happen. And listen, I've said this before publicly. I've got it in my prayer app of praying even for my vacations. I have no idea when my next vacation will be. I have no idea where I'll be going. But I've already begun to pray, Lord, if and when that happens, I've prayed that He would protect it and bless it. I pray that He would protect my family, my church family, us, that He would refresh us spiritually and physically. I've already started to pray that prayer because I know that even my vacation is not in my control. I can plan when the time comes, but I'm not in control of that. And we're being reminded that this merchant in this parable thinks they ultimately control what's next, and they fail to recognize God's providential control. God's providential control is a thing that we cannot lose sight of. So though we may live in denial, tragedy and misfortune will soon force us, eventually, whether you acknowledge it this morning or not, there will be tragedies in our life and misfortunes in our life, trials and tribulations in our life that will force us one way or the other, whether you do it this morning or not, whether in your own pride you don't think this works for you, eventually your circumstances will force you to recognize that you have an inability to make things work out the way that you want. You have an inability in the whole scheme of things to work out things the way that you want. God is ultimately in control. And so we live and move only at the permission of God. And so James does not discourage us from planning and doing, and he's not. Only from planning and doing, please hear this. He's not telling you not to plan and not to go, but he is discouraging planning and doing apart from relying upon God. I love what we see in Luke chapter 12. Luke chapter 12. And he told them a parable saying, the land of a rich man produced plentifully. And he thought to himself, what shall I do? For I have nowhere to store my crops. And he said, I will do this. I will tear down my barns and build larger ones. And there I will store all my grain and my goods. And I will say to my soul, soul, you have ample goods laid up for many years. Relax, eat, drink, be merry. Listen to verse 20, Luke 12. But God said, fool, this night your soul is required of you, and the things you have prepared, whose will they be? So is the one who lays up treasure for himself and is not rich towards God. Now, ultimately, we see planning in that parable. Again, that's not the whole point of that parable, but we see even in that parable, foolish planning with no acknowledgement of who God is. And so we see here in these first few verses, 13 and 14, that this presumptuous living is ultimately when we foolishly disregard the will of God. We take no thought of what God's will is in that decision or that endeavor. But then in verse 15, we also see that presumptuous living is knowingly disobeying the will of God. Not only is it not even acknowledging the will of God, but it's knowingly disobeying the will of God. Verse 15, instead you ought to say, if the Lord wills, we will live and do this or that. James makes it clear once again he's not against planning. Rather, James wants God to be in control of such planning. There's a danger in the cliche that we use, Lord willing, whatever the Lord wills, your will be done. But we must not just say that, use that church lingo, but rather, as James did, we should want God to be in control of our planning. His ways are best. As it is, you boast, verse 16, as it is, you boast in your arrogance. All such boasting is evil. And so the merchants are not criticized for the wealth they possess, or even the pursuit of more wealth. Rather, they are doing so without any regard to God, any reference to God. It's all about what they think is next and what they should do. Uh, this presumption of boasting about future plans. Not only are we leaving God out of our planning, but we're boasting in our own autonomy. We think we're ultimately in control of every detail of our life when we live that way. And this comes from an arrogant view of the future, and it's an arrogant view of ourself. We at times can be very guilty of forgetting God's sovereignty and ultimately disregarding God's will. Disregarding God's will. You know, a practical thought on this, even this week, Liz and I had to have a discussion on being good stewards of God's money. On Caden was obviously a part of the varsity team going to the state tournament in Owensboro, and praying through and having that conversation. Was it the best use of our money? Not that we don't support Caden, but we live, as many of you do, month to month, bills to pay, debt to pay off, decisions to make. Was it the best use of God's money to drive to Owensboro after both of us had worked all day, and tickets, gas, food, and hotel to a game, which could have been just one game, and which it ended up being. We wanted them to win, obviously. Was that use of money with Caden not playing? Was that the best use? And so for us, practically, it was more about what the Lord would want us to do than it was what we wanted to do. We obviously are always going to choose to go and support Caden, whether he plays or not. And so we have to make those decisions as parents. And so I think we should involve the Lord in every decision. He is sovereign over our lives. And sometimes we think, well, that's not that big a deal to include God in it. Yes, it is. Our lives matter to God, and we should seek Him out in all things. Verse 17. So whoever knows the right thing to do and fails to do it, for him it is sin. So James here argues sin is not doing what God forbids, sin of commission. So it's not only, sin is not only doing what God forbids, like sins of commission, as I mentioned, but also failing to do what God asks us to do, sins of omission. So not praying, not evangelizing, that is sin. And so, in conclusion, most, I would say this morning at Bethel, would affirm that you believe in the sovereignty of God. You're living and desire to live in complete dependence upon Him, but in planning and managing our day-to-day lives, we find ourselves, hear this, we find ourselves practically functioning, planning, managing our days as practical atheists. And that's tough. We would say we believe in the sovereignty of God and we're completely dependent upon Him, but we find often in our planning of day-to-day, we're managing our day-to-day lives as if we're an atheist. We have already determined what's going to go on in our lives. Where in our lives do we need to remember, where in our lives, for you and me, it's going to look different. Where in our lives do we need to remember that we're dependent creatures before a sovereign creator? Maybe for you, you need to be reminded in your kid's future. We like to determine what we think our kid's future is going to be. If you had told me years ago, based on my background and where I was successful, I thought for sure Caden be playing football. I thought for sure he would want to watch some WWE action with me. I grew up with that. He cares less about any kind of WWE match. Football's been on his mind, but he has never played a down of football outside of any kind of pickup stuff. We like to plan our kids' future. We think we know best. We do the same thing with our marriage as well, right? I've told you before, I was looking for all the wrong things, and I thought for sure I would be married to a gal that would go out and shoot hoops with me. That's not Liz. And I love Liz, and I'm thankful that God's plans are much better than mine. We try to map our lives out, don't we? Our work. If you had asked me at 16 years old, if you had asked me at 20 years old, if you had asked me at 24 years old, I did not envision me pastoring. I can promise you that. Our hobbies. We don't include God. We think we've got this all mapped out. We're sovereign over our lives. We really live that way. And so I want you to think about this, and I'm gonna get into your business a little bit. I've got into my own business this morning, and I've been in my business all week preparing for Obadiah. But I think some practical ways that we see this within the church life, not only with our kids' future and our marriage and work. We may find ourselves this morning becoming more irregular to church and gathering with God's people. Gathering with God's people is just not a priority. And honestly, that's been a little bit of my concern with this weather because I know the reality for some, if they miss 1 week, 2 and 3, 4 and 5 is going to become really easy. We're really busy and tired is what we try to convince ourselves of. But not gathering for church is a sin of omission unless you're homebound, unless you're sick, traveling. It's not safe. If you have circumstances that prevent you, I'm obviously not speaking of everyone, right? But there's no way that as born again believers that have the ability to gather with God's people on a Wednesday or Sunday are like asking God and involving God in the planning of our schedules. Where obviously, for some within Bethel and throughout the church in America, there's a reason there's a sharp decline in gathering. We're obviously not asking God, hey, God, do I need to gather with the saints today? What about this one as well? Are we living as practical atheists? Are we seeking God's wisdom and not spending time in prayer and Bible study and enjoying the presence of God? Are we involving God in our lives? Listen, if you're not spending time in prayer and Bible study on a daily and weekly basis, the last thing you're going to do is involve God in your planning. You're going to live according to your truth that you develop in your mind. And you'll convince yourself, you'll say, I've got too many things going on right now. I don't have time to pray and read the Word. You won't say that publicly, but you'll say it privately in your own way. Or maybe you realize you're not serving others as you ought to do. Maybe you're not giving your spouse and kids the time each day that you should. You're giving them the bare scraps. You're focused more on your work life. And you try to throw in Christian stuff, but then eventually you get to the point where you just say there's no time. See, the bottom line this morning, and it's a truth that we don't like to hear because we all struggle with it, we're prone to sin in our planning. We're prone to sin in our planning today and with our futures. We don't often, with all seriousness and submission, say, Lord willing, whatever you want, Lord. Now please hear that. We don't often do that in all seriousness and submission, say, Lord, your will be done. Where should I go? How should I handle the situation? If we would begin to ask that question, we would probably, more than likely this morning, be able to acknowledge our lives would look radically different if we did so. We have made earthly desires a priority. Every single one of us, including myself, we had made earthly desires in one way or the other a priority, and we have planned around it. I thought about this morning, I have a good friend that I don't get to interact with them very often anymore. I'd reached out this week to them, but I've watched them for years neglect their family, And not only did they neglect their family and thankfully didn't lose their marriage, but got close to losing their marriage. Um, I watched them neglect their family. I watched them neglect their worship uh, to fulfill their desire of a particular hobby. A hobby had become their God. Now, as a born again believer, would God ever give you guidance and encouragement to neglect your family or neglect worship for the sake of a hobby? There's no way. We see it, church. We see professing believers sinning on a daily basis as we plan for each day, as we plan for our weeks, as we plan for the future, and we do so acting as if we are God and He is not. Let me ask this question and we'll wrap it up this morning. Are you being driven by what matters most to God or you? Let me ask it one more time. Are you being driven by what matters most to God, or are you being driven this morning by what matters most to you? I have no idea who's listening this morning. I hope that majority of our church will take time to gather around the Word. I hope so. But I have no idea. I don't know if other people that typically don't listen are listening. I have no idea. But every one of us need to ask this question. Are we being driven by what matters most to God, or are we being driven by what matters most to us? I love you, church. I would much rather be with you today, but may God use the Word through YouTube and WHBN for the glory of His great name. Look forward to seeing you soon. Love you so much, church. Stay safe and stay warm. God bless.